Hello, it is Scott Bullicky again, and I am going to be talking to you about the fourth unit in Living by Chemistry, which is entitled Toxins. Now, it's very important that you consult your pacing guide because Boston recommends that this unit is taught third, and furthermore, that a fire unit interlude is taught in the earlier portion of the unit. So although I'll be talking about it as Unit 4, which is what the curriculum has designated it as, Boston recommends that toxins be taught third with a fire interlude. So what I will be doing in the screencast is giving you an overview of the toxins unit, talking about some difficult lessons, actually a whole difficult section in the curriculum, and providing some additional resources. So the unit is organized into 5 sections. It's a longer unit. The first section is entitled Toxic Changes, and it is all about learning about reaction types and balancing chemical reactions. After this section, BPS recommends that you have a first fire interlude. Consult your pacing guide for more details on that. Then after the fire interlude, we would go back to the toxins unit and measuring toxins, which involves mass mole conversions, toxins in solution, which involves the idea of concentration, and then acidic toxins, which has students focusing on the concentration of particular ions, hydroxide and hydronium. Finally, toxic cleanup section deals with the precipitation reaction as well as limiting reactant stoichiometry and percent yield. So I'm now going to go over to the online version of the textbook and just briefly discuss the lessons in the sections. So in section 1, toxic changes, in lesson 1, we have some cards which need to be prepared in advance for students to categorize reactions according to their toxic action on the body. In lesson 2, a laboratory setup is prepared for students so that they can make connections between the written chemical reaction and their observations. In lesson 3, students will be looking at reactions which are purely physical, some which are purely chemical, and some which have components of both. In lesson 4, students will be doing some experiments which confirm the law of conservation of mass. In lesson 5, students will learn how to balance chemical equations, and in lesson 6, students will practice balancing chemical equations as well as categorizing toxic reactions according to traditional definitions such as synthesis, single replacement, double replacement, etc. In section 2, when we're talking about measuring toxins, in lesson 7, we learn about LD50 as a means of looking at the quantity of a toxic substance. In lesson 8, students learn how to model atoms by using manipulatives such as grains of rice or beans in order to count by weighing. And in lesson 9, they translate that to the scale which is used by chemists in the sense of using Avogadro's number to keep track of how many particles there are per mole. In lesson 10, they get a macro view of really how much a mole is. A little bit of trivia, a mole of aluminum is just a little bit more than the amount that goes into 2 cans. In lesson 11, students practice making mass mole conversions, and in lesson 12, they apply this to a debate regarding artificial sweeteners. In section 3, when we're talking about toxins in solution, we're talking about first, barely alive, lesson 13, where students observe the effect of different solution concentrations on a gummy bear. In lesson 14, students develop a micro model for why that occurs based upon some molecule views. In lesson 15, they prepare solutions of different concentrations and learn how to do that. And in lesson 16, they have an experiment in which they identify unknown solutions according to criteria that the students themselves will develop in inquiry experiment. Section 4 is actually a whole difficult section. So you can note now that it's all about acids and bases, but I will talk about that in more detail in the difficult section following the overview of the unit. Lesson 23 in section 5 is where students observe precipitation reactions and learn that certain things produce a precipitate when mixed and others don't. In lesson 24, they find that they can optimize the amount of precipitate by mixing quantities of substances that line up with the mole ratio in the balanced equation. In lesson 25, students learn how to make mole-mole conversions in a balanced chemical equation. They learn how to do stoichiometry. And in lesson 26, they learn how to do limiting reactant calculations and how to calculate percent yield. Lessons 25 and lesson 26 are allocated extra time in the pacing guide, something else to consult. So in lesson 16, this is what I believe is one of the difficult lessons. This is where students are supposed to identify 3 solutions, one of which is sodium hydroxide, one of which is potassium chloride, and one of which is sodium bromide, solely based upon measurements that they make. And the challenge of that is that the measurements need to be extra precise and the solutions need to be prepared properly. So something to keep in mind is like electronic balances will really help. Several graduated cylinders with as much precision as you can provide will help. And be very aware that if you don't make an individual kit for each group in each class, cross-contamination is something you have to really watch out for, really be monitoring to make sure students don't cross-contaminate. However, it is possible just using sodium chloride to make solutions with appropriate densities so they don't actually need to have the different solutions in there. So it is possible using sodium chloride, which is readily available and cheap, to make a lot of stock solution of each of the 3 quote-unquote mystery solutions. Now, difficult lesson 2, I think actually all of section 4 should be considered a series of difficult lessons because it's experiment after experiment after experiment. Give yourself extra time and start preparing this section early because there is a lot to prep every day. And the lessons work really well when properly prepared, but that takes time. So just want to give you a heads up on that. Lesson 17, students identify that certain things turn indicators, certain colors, and we can categorize those things as acids and bases. You need to prepare lots of dropper bottles, and you need to prepare cabbage juice and universal indicator in advance. Lesson 18 involves cards, which show the molecular view of why this would be. Those cards need to be printed out and cut up in advance. Lesson 19, in which students connect the idea of concentration and pH. pH paper needs to be available, and students need to have precise solutions in order to discover what is being discussed in the worksheet. In lesson 20, this is where students would carry out a serial dilution. It's very important that they be doing these with distilled water. This can be made in a distiller or this can be purchased at a grocery store. They need to have a very precise starting concentration of acid or also of the base, and they need to have measurement devices that enable them to make very precise measures. Okay, so we're talking 10 milliliter graduated cylinders and droppers to level them, and students need to be very careful, and cleaning is very important from class to class. In lesson 21, be aware that bromethymol blue is somewhat finicky and it is difficult to get it to be perfectly green. It's something that students can do, but they need to be instructed to be very careful. And my recommendation for lesson 22 is that rather than carrying it out as a titration with the droppers, I would recommend carrying it out as a titration with a burette, of which there are many procedures available. There are some online procedures available from my website, which I will share on the next page. So, resources that are going to be helpful, supplemental lessons and animations, as I just mentioned. You can find those from my useful links page of my website, a little bit of a setup for a digital titration. And as previously mentioned, pacing guides and the calendar are super important for this unit because it is now straying from the order in which the curriculum has proposed. You can always contact me or Holly Rosa or Pam Pelletier if you have any questions, and there will be other screencasts about other units in Living by Chemistry.